Welcome to the other side of Lucy Letby. In episode 28, we're going to look at the expert witness evidence of Professor Peter Hindmarsh. Now, I have no doubt that Professor Hindmarsh is an extraordinarily talented endocrinologist, and he's at the University College of London, which I'm sure is an extraordinarily respectable institution, and his consultancy is in pediatric endocrinology and diabetes. This is a man who we really have to listen to. But the one thing that Professor Hindmarsh isn't is he's not an expert in mathematics, but he's going to use a lot of mathematics drawing up his conclusions, or rather assumptions, in his evidence. Again, let's just go through what happened. We have Nicholas Johnson, KC, for the prosecution, asked whether Professor Hindmarsh was contacted by Chester police, and he confirms he was. Professor Hindmarsh confirms he was told that there was a suspicion that baby Ev had received insulin in an exogenous way. In other words, through an infusion or an injection. He said he concluded the cause of hypoglycemia was exogenous. He reached a conclusion that insulin was the cause of the hypoglycemia that was recorded, that's the low blood sugar that was recorded during an episode of vomiting and tachycardia, etc. That was reported in Dr. Hartness' evidence on the night of August 4th to 5th. And he said the chemical findings were compatible with the administration of exogenous insulin. Okay, let's see how he works that out. The court hears about child F's blood sugar being slightly below normal just after birth. The baby had hypoglycemia just after birth. It's very common. And he was given 10% dextrose, and that resolved the blood sugar level to a normal rate. There was also a point around the 30th to the 31st of July when baby Ev's blood sugar level rose to a higher than normal rate, and he was given a tiny amount of insulin to lower the rate. Subsequent blood sugar readings returned to normal. What we have here is a baby, an uterine growth restricted baby who's on a ventilator. Is a diagnosis of sepsis, RDS, all that stuff, and no ability to control his blood sugar levels at all. He's gone from hypoglycemia, low blood sugar, to hyperglycemia, all in the space of a day or two. And to put all this into context of what we know, preterm neonates with intrauterine growth restriction are at a much higher risk for hypoglycemia after birth, because we've talked before about their limited glycogen stores. This is the glucose that we keep in reserve in the liver. Lack of fat stores, because the babies have no weight on them, particularly in their intrauterine growth restricted. An increased brain to body weight ratio, an increased sensitivity to insulin. So remember, their hormone system for regulating all these things is not complete and not predictable, because the pancreas isn't ready to do that. Also, this baby is on a ventilator with sepsis and jaundice, and very sick baby. There's a lot of stress hormones floating about, and they can inhibit insulin, the action of insulin, and they can promote the building up of this glycogen product. And then sometimes the babies just get too much glucose in the infusions of dextrose that they're given, and particularly when they're already incapable of managing glucose in the body. None of this here stuff is at all unusual. Then, in the usual way, we go from July 30, 31 straight to August 4th and 5th. Nothing's happened in between type thing. The court has now shown baby Ev's observation chart for the night of August 4th to 5th. Baby F's heart rate rose from around 150 beats a minute to 200 to 210 beats a minute between 1:15 and 4 a.m. And the baby had received a TPN bag of nutrition at 12:25 a.m. on August the 5th. That was like 20 minutes before. TPN is really important because we know vomiting and tachycardia, what the baby's blood sugars and the dextrose that the baby was given over a period between the 29th and the 4th, because that will tell us whether or not the baby had sufficient glucose to build up this glycogen store. You have to remember, when you have an excess of glucose, the first thing the insulin will do is create the glycogen store, and the second thing it'll do is add fat tissue, which can be broken down later on. But you need to have enough of that. We see that when the baby was born, blood sugar was kind of all right, 2.7, then it went to 1.9, and then a 10% glucose infusion was started. Sometime on the 30th, a TPN, a total parenteral nutrition bag, was added, and presumably it started on the 30th. It's hard to know, and ran for 48 hours, and we don't know how much glucose was in it, but the blood sugars rocketed up after that TPN bag. On the 30th, 31st, right through to the 2nd of August, we get hyperglycemia. But we've also, during this time, we have again extubation of the baby and then trying to withdraw CPAP breathing support really, really fast. Baby's having a lot of desaturations. It's got jaundice, respiratory distress syndrome, and it would be on very little breast milk. But also, the TPN bags, there's a lot of confusion on the TPN bags. What was in them, what composition was in the TPNs. There's not enough information on that, and that again is something that Myers should have got more information on. And without knowing what the total amount of glucose given, it's very, very hard to know. There was also lipids in the first bags, and the other thing of note was the initial prescription of insulin was 0.2 units per kilogram per minute for insulin, and the recommended dose is usually 0.01, 0.05 as an initial dose. It varies, but this is a very high starting dose of insulin for an infusion. And yet, even when this infusion started, it didn't bring the glucose down to normal levels until the 3rd. We have TPN bags going, we have insulin going, and we still don't get normal blood sugars. By the 3rd of the 8th, the baby was on 11 mils of breast milk every 2 hours, doing quite well that way. But the TPN bag is still continuing. And then we have, on the 4th, we have this switch to Optiflow, that's the nasal, and less invasive positive pressure, nasal high flow cannula. But we have the raised urea and creatinine levels at that stage. We have possible problem with the kidneys, none of which is Professor Henmars is now going to take into account. Remember, we have the TPN bags, but the TPN bags keep changing, or it's difficult to track what they're given. But TPN bags can cause vomiting and tachycardia in preterm neonates, even though the TPN that's going into the vein bypasses the gastrointestinal tract. It can still lead to gastrointestinal symptoms because you can get abnormal blood sugars, fats and electrolytes, which can cause vomiting. Just bear in mind that for physiological reasons to do with putting nutrition directly into the blood can still affect the gastrointestinal tract and can lead to vomiting and tachycardia, which could as likely explain the event on the 4th to 5th. We go back to the show child's observation chart. We can see that there's a very strong temporal relationship between the 12:25 a.m. August 5th TPN nutrition bag and 20 minutes later vomiting and tachycardia. That is a common side effect of TPN. Then baby Ev's blood sugar reading at 1:54 a.m. was 0.8, which is very low. And Professor Hindmarsh says it is a significant difference and extremely low. Mr. Johnson, was it a cause for concern? And Professor Hindmarsh says absolutely. Then a table created by Professor Hindmarsh records all of BBF's blood sugar readings from 11:32 on August the 4th to 9:17 p.m. on August the 5th. But what he doesn't record alongside them is what glucose was going into the baby at the same time. We have readings of 0.8, 2.3, 1.9, 2.9, 1.7, 1.3, 1.4, 2.4, 1.9, 1.9, 1.9, 2.5, 4.1. Now, Professor Hindmarsh wants me to believe that these readings were created by astronomical an insulin level in the baby. We have to convert these readings that they give for BBF as 4,600, and that is in a measurement called picomoles per litre. That's equivalent to 800 microunits per mil. The geometric mean in one study for neonates was between 9 and 13 microunits per mil, up to 18 to 24, depending on the gestation. In adults, a normal fasting insulin level is 25 microunits per mil. They're trying to get me to believe that this baby had 800 microunits per mil in its blood. And it gets even more complicated than that. But as you can see, that's about 30 times higher than you would find in an adult. And yet we are producing glucose, some of which are pretty close to normal. Professor Hindmarsh says the hypoglycemia is persistent right through the day until the conclusion of the TPN bag at 6:55 p.m. The 5 a.m. reading of 2.9, which the court hears is considered normal, is gone into in further detail. Mr. Johnson asked the court to show the intensive care chart for BBF for August 5th. Not for the rest of the time, but for August 5th. For the 5 a.m. reading, the blood sugar reading signature has the initials LL. There you go. The chart also shows Professor Hindmarsh notes to provide context for the blood sugar readings throughout the day when changes are made to the infusions of BBF. Professor Hindmarsh says that despite 5 boluses of 10% dextrose and ongoing glucose delivery from a 10% dextrose infusion and the glucose contained within the TPN bag, he said that that in total would give a glucose infusion which would be at minimum twice the normal daily requirement of a baby. But what is twice the normal daily requirement of a baby? It's going to vary much that there's no such thing as twice the normal daily requirement. That's an average figure. And again, we're talking about an intrauterine growth restricted baby who's extremely ill and has already lost roughly 10% of its body weight. It's really ill. It's hypermetabolic. It's using up glucose far faster than any adult would use it up. We have to take all that into account just to simply say twice the normal daily requirement of a baby is infantile. And he said it is likely more glucose is being delivered from the bolus injections. It is likely, but why does he not know? I mean, the infusion rate, the quantity of dextrose in the infusion, the rate of infusion should be in the chart. You should be able to calculate exactly how much dextrose went into the baby. But he said it's likely more of the glucose was delivered by bolus injection. You should be able to tell exactly how much went by bolus and how much went by the TPN bag. But what he doesn't mention here either is how were the bolus injections given? No one's asked about that. Were they just fired in, like within seconds, or were they given over a 10-minute period, like they should be? And what effect would that have in this really dynamic system? But again, the defence didn't go into any of that. Professor Hindmarsh has noted 3 events. So narrowed down to 3 events during August 5th, after 1:54 a.m, when the TPN bag was administered. At 10 a.m, there was a problem with the cannula infusion, which meant the line had to be resighted. Oh, here we go. This TPN wasn't delivering dextrose into the baby for a period of time that we don't know. Because when you notice that this cannula infusion has discontinued, it could have stopped hours before that. The 2 further glucose readings are 1.4 and 2.4, implying that the blood glucose level had started to rise spontaneously, as there is no contribution from the intravenous route. I mean, how can anybody make that leap? We'll carry on. Mr. Johnson said after BBF was taken off the double dose of dextrose during that time, his blood sugars actually rose. Well, why would that be an issue? Because you've given him far more dextrose than he needed. He's built up glycogen stores and his blood sugar is going to rise. And Professor Hindmarsh says, that's how I see it, and I believe that is correct. It's a possibility, I suppose. The reading was heading in the wrong direction, down to 1.9 by 2 p.m, the court hears. Now, Professor Hindmarsh is speaking as if blood sugar readings in preterm neonates are totally predictable, when they are absolutely not, because the beta cells in the pancreas that make the insulin are not mature. They can't read the signals, they can't produce the insulin the same as an adult can. They are not in any way comparable yet far. We have no mention of that. The infusion is stopped at 6:55 p.m. And Mr. Johnson, is there a paradox between a child receiving glucose and their blood sugar falling? And Professor Hindmarsh says, correct. Is there a paradox between a child receiving glucose and their blood sugar falling? Well, if there is a paradox, that happens all the time. If you don't receive enough glucose and you're hypersensitive to insulin, your sensitivity to insulin is changing. It is not the same. It's a dynamic sensitivity to insulin. Your blood sugar could go up or down. Neonatologists will know that struggling with blood sugars in preterm neonates in the first few days of life, particularly when they're ill, is not an exact science. Mr. Johnson asks about the apparent disparity. Professor Hindmarsh says laboratory readings of blood plasma 1.3 differs from the neo patient reading, that was the bedside reading, of 1.9. He explains a discrepancy of up to 0.8 between the two is considered acceptable. You can see what trouble we're in with this. A discrepancy between a bedside test and a laboratory test of 0.8 is a discrepancy between hypoglycemia and euglycemia or normal glycemia. If you're constantly measuring low blood sugars that are 0.8 lower than they actually are, you could be measuring a baby that has quite normal blood sugars. He says whichever is the more accurate reading, the 1.3 or 1.9 is still very low. There is his admission, whichever is the more accurate reading. Now, this is a murder trial, and this is evidence in a murder trial, and we're arguing about the accuracy of the data that we're using to convict someone. BBF's blood test results from the laboratory, as shown earlier to the court today, is presented to Professor Hindmarsh. The sample was taken at 5:56 on August 5th and collected at the Liverpool laboratory at 4:15 p.m. on August the 6th. This is the insulin C-peptide blood. We have absolutely no chain of custody record here for this. It's taken as a clinical sample and it's now being used as a forensic sample. And the defence should have jumped on that. This was not the appropriate test to prove the use of exogenous insulin. They should have jumped all over it, but they didn't. He says the insulin reading should be in proportion to the insulin C-peptide reading and should be several times higher in this context. No, it shouldn't, because we're talking about a preterm baby. Preterm babies have widely fluctuating readings on these immunoassays. You might be able to put a proportional several times higher context in an adult, but not in a preterm neonate. And Professor Hindmarsh explains to the court the dangers of prolonged low blood sugar. And he talks about breakdown of fats can be used as a temporary measure, as a substitute. What fat? The baby weighs 1,200 grams. Again, he's talking about adults. The problem, he says, is if the low blood sugar is caused by excess insulin, the insulin will switch off key body formation. We're saying that the insulin in an adult will not release sugar from fat, but the baby hasn't got any fat. He says the brain would be in a very, very susceptible state to receiving damage, and that would depend on the depth and length of the hypoglycemic episode. But remember, Dr. Hartness told us the baby was handling well and looked grand. The equivalent reading of 2.3 would lead to confusion and difficulties reading and writing. Well, preterm neonates can't read or write. Again, we can see that Professor Hindmarsh is speaking about adults. Professor Hindmarsh says lower readings than that could lead to seizures, deaths of brain cells, coma, and in some cases death. Professor Hindmarsh adds in his report, the insulin used in the hospital has been used for the past 20 to 25 years and is synthetic insulin. Stocks of pig cow insulin would not be held at a regular stock in a pharmacy. Again, we're talking about things that aren't even relevant. The two types of synthetic insulin are fast-acting and work within 30 minutes. Applied via an injection, the effectiveness lasting 4 to 6 hours. There's a huge variation. They work within 30 minutes and they last for 4 to 6 hours. And the other type lasts between 12 and 24 hours. There's two enormous variations that need to be applied to any mathematical calculations that will subsequently go on. The second type of insulin, he explains, is generally not used. They're using the short-acting insulin. Professor Hindmarsh has shown a 10 ml bottle of insulin, which normally comes in an orange self-sealing cap. And to extract the liquid from the bottle to administer therapeutically, Mr. Johnson says, by therapeutically you mean legitimately. Professor Hindmarsh agrees. He says the dose would have to be measured out carefully. The insulin bottle exhibited is shown to members of the jury and the defence. Presumably this is not the insulin bottle that was in the fridge at the time. This is an example of an insulin bottle. Once a syringe is put into the bottle self-seals when the syringe is removed, the court hears. Professor Hindmarsh says it is not possible to give insulin by mouth, as it is a large molecule. Well, insulin's a peptide. It's a 50-chain amino acid. I wouldn't call it a particularly large molecule. But no one gives insulin by mouth. Again, I don't know why he's talking about that. And the only way would be through the skin or intravenously, he says. For a skin injection, he says the duration of action for the insulin of 4 to 6 hours would not fit with the 17 hours of hypoglycemia. It would require multiple injections. But if we look at rabbit, This is the insulin that the baby was given. It has a duration of action approximately 6 to 8 hours, not 4 to 6 hours, in preterm neonates. And high doses of it are not documented very well. There's not a lot of knowledge known. And the half-life, that's the amount of time that it takes to break it down, can range from 5 to 15 minutes. But the overall duration of action can be longer because of things like insulin resistance and the immaturity of the whole glucose transport system. But again, none of that is put into context here. This evidence is meaningless to me. Then he goes on to say the second route, or putting it into an infusion bag, was probably the most likely way of achieving the blood glucose effects that we have observed. The infusion would be continuous, using the bags available, and fit nicely with the time course of events. But would it fit nicely with the time of course? He's saying 4 to 6 hours. He's saying an onset of in 20 minutes, and we've got different glucose going in, different feeds going in during that time. And he's referring to adults, steady state insulin dynamics in adults, which don't exist in preterm neonates. And then he goes on to say that it would also be consistent with the measurements that took place during the TPN bag. In order for it to be consistent with it, you would have to know how much insulin went into the bag. And nobody knows how much insulin went into the bag because no one tested the bag. Professor Hinmar says the exogenous insulin, the fast-acting type, would have reduced from the 4,657 reading, that's 30 times higher than an adult, reading to almost none after a couple of hours when the TPN bag was stopped. And the rise of blood sugar in BBF from 4 to 4.1 at 9 p.m. was entirely consistent with that. It's entirely consistent that a baby had 30 times the adult dose of typical adult dose of glucose in the system and didn't die. I don't think that's entirely consistent at all. And then Professor Hinmar says a rate of 0.56 mils per hour of insulin would have been required to lower baby F's blood sugar levels on the TPN bag. 0.56 mils per hour of insulin, that comes out at, if I'm reading this right, 0.5 mils per hour of insulin. I presume by that he means the Act Rapid insulin had half a mil or 5.56 mils running for 17 hours. That would be 10 mils, a whole vat of insulin. But it wouldn't even be a whole vat of insulin. It would be 2 whole vials of insulin, at least, because the dextrose itself and the bag, that the TPN bag, plastic that the TPN bag is made from, absorbs the insulin, at least 50% of it. I'd say, as a conservative estimate, that has to be 2 bottles of insulin, by his calculation, if I'm reading it right, because we know that the infusion rate is 4 mils an hour of the TPN bag. If he says it's about 0.56 mils per hour of insulin, you have to assume that he means that's the amount of insulin going in every hour. And he calculated this given the insulin level administered to lower baby F's blood sugar level on July 31st. He is saying that this baby's adaptation to extrauterine life hasn't changed in 5 days. I just can't understand any of this. Mr. Johnson, would that level have been visible to the naked eye? No. Mr. Johnson asked if the stock TPN bag, which contains the same degree as the bespoke bag, this is all the confusion about what was the baby actually getting fed. Professor Hinmar says that the glucose concentrations are not much different from 1:54 a.m. to 10 a.m. when the bag is changed. And after then, the contents and contamination are probably about the same. Mr. Johnson asked about Professor Hindmarsh's conclusion that the fluids he was receiving only had been contaminated with insulin, and he said, yes, I do. Then we get Ben Myers, and this isn't going to be much fun. And he's asking Professor Hindmarsh questions. He said the fast-acting insulin is not visible. Professor Hindmarsh confirms the type of insulin would have a distinctive smell about it. Came ruffling the la again. Mr. Myers says the concentration of insulin administered could, over time, lead to complications in the patient, and he said that's correct. Mr. Myers said it would take 25 minutes before the insulin administered would have its effect. Professor Hindmarsh said it would take about 25 minutes for it to have its biggest effect. But other sources claim that it generally starts to lower the blood glucose level within 30 minutes to an hour, and the maximum effect is reached 1.5 to 3.5 hours, and the entire duration of action is approximately 7 to 8 hours. But this is what's called the pharmacokinetics, how drugs work. And the pharmacokinetics of insulin in neonates can be influenced by many different things: the gestational age, the sensitivity to the insulin, and the presence of underlying conditions, the things that we've already talked about. It is wholly unpredictable. There would have been disagreement between one expert and another on that matter. And then Myers says, other than the heart rate and vomiting, which I told you could have been caused by the TPN, BBF did not appear to suffer any physical symptoms from the low blood sugar levels. And he asked, given the high level of insulin seen, 30 times higher than an adult, would there be more powerful physical consequences? And Professor Hindmarsh says, vomiting is not an unusual feature. In the magnitude of features, he says, the effects would be on the brain function rather than on peripheral manifestations. But what does he think controls the peripheral nervous system? The brain. So of course you would see effects in the peripheral nervous system if the brain was affected. He said physical features of hypoglycemia would not be easy to pick up in a newborn or a premature baby. Neurologically, that's quite different. But yet we were talking about handwriting within the same evidence. The features would also be extremely variable. The first symptom could and often would be collapse and seizure. Mr. Myers says it is an alleged 17-hour period of exposure to high levels of insulin, and the effects would have been more apparent. Professor Hindmarsh says high levels of insulin have been recorded in babies with underlying conditions, and they may present well up to the point of collapse. I don't think we're going to find any studies where high levels of insulin for 17 hours, 30 times that which you would expect to see in an adult, are going to have minimal effects on the baby. The intensive care chart for BBF is presented to the court again. The blood sugar reading is 2.9, recorded for 5 a.m. 2.9 would present in the normal range, wouldn't it? A normal range would be 3.5 or above, Professor Hindmarsh says. Well, again, there's just huge disagreement on this. A reading of 0.8 at 1:54 and 2.3 at 2:55, Mr. Myers said, while low, is a significant increase. Of course it is. He showed an IV chart in the intervening period at 2:05, administration of 10% dextrose for BBF. Mr. Myers says the infusion chart shown to the court has a 10% dextrose bolus at 4:20 a.m. Mr. Myers adds that 4:02 and 5 a.m. the blood glucose reading of BBF rises from 1.9 to 2.9. Mr. Myers refers to the level of contamination in the TPN bags. He refers to the blood sample taken at 5:56 on August the 5th, nearly 17 hours after the first TPN bag was put up for BBF. He says that reading only applies to the second TPN bag. Professor Hindmar says it did, yes. Mr. Meyer says that wouldn't tell us what the insulin level was 12 a.m., would it? Professor Hindmarsh, no, it wouldn't. We haven't measured that. Don't forget now, Letby spiked, according to them, Letby spiked 2 insulin bags. The first one was taken down before it was completed because it had leaked into the baby's body, we don't know for how long, and caused a swelling of the leg and pain and stress. And that would affect insulin as well. And then it was swapped over to a new TPN bag, which just happened to have been spiked by Lucy Letby as well. By my calculation on what Professor Hindmarsh has said here, we need 4 bottles of insulin to get that same effect. So what factors do I think research can't possibly know and can't factor into his calculations? Insulin resistance, steady state level of insulin production in a 31-week preterm neonate, the effects of the urea, the creatinine, and the matrix problem that we talked about in episode 27, the lipids, the absorption of insulin by the bag and the given set, hemolysis, that's the breakdown of blood, the effects of sepsis, dehydration, inflammation and oxidative stress, the temperature of the bag, the acidity of the bag, the particular C-peptide excretion in BBF, the half-life of insulin in BBF, which is not going to be the same as the half-life of insulin in another baby, and all the forensic stuff that should really go with chain of custody for this test, the suitability of the test, pro-insulin antibodies. You could go on for a long time. My calculation was 23 mils per bag, which is 4 bottles of 100 unit per mil insulin, and I'm pretty sure that that is wrong calculation as well, because I can't account for all the variables. In fact, it's impossible to account for all the variables. One single immunoassay test cannot yield that amount of information. I'm sorry, but it can't. And I don't think it would be very difficult to get an expert to put this story straight. I also think that the insulin cases will be the first to collapse. And if I was Mark MacDonald, this is where I would go first. Without a question, this is where I would go first. Pop-up prosecutor, he comes back and he says, Mr. Johnson, for the prosecution, rises to clarify insulin levels. He asks if it would be reasonable to infer that if BBF had similar blood glucose levels throughout the day, he had similar insulin levels inside him during the day. Professor Hindmar says there is a caveat in that there have been efforts to raise BBF's blood sugar during the day through 10% dextrose boluses. Overall, the infusion rate has essentially stayed the same. There is a caveat, but we'll ignore it. Well, the other caveat is that studies have shown that there's no correlation between insulin levels and blood glucose levels in preterm neonates. The measurements are all over the show, and again, that's because of the varying resistance of the cells to insulin in these preterm neonates. Again, I would have to disagree with this. And then he goes on, I can't be absolutely sure, but it's safe to assume that the glucose infusion rate did not change, which would imply that the amount of insulin around would be similar throughout the 17-hour period, allowing for the breaks when the infusion was discontinued. And he adds that that's his conclusion. But he can't be sure. But I thought you had to be sure to convict someone of murder. And I didn't think it was safe to assume all of these assumptions that don't apply to preterm neonates. And then we get Ben Myers coming again. One more query to which Professor Hindmarsh clarifies that the measurement of blood glucose is not a measurement of insulin or insulin C-peptide, but there are clear relationships between the two in adults, not always preterm neonates. and what the relationships would expect to be. He adds the blood glucose level via infusion was consistent, and it would be reasonable to assume the insulin infusion would also be the same rate it was at 5:56 as it would be earlier in the day. Assumption after assumption after assumption after assumption. We have another problem with this as well. The C-peptide reading was 169. That means that not only was BBF getting exogenous insulin 30 times higher than an adult typical level, but it was continuing to make its own insulin at the same time. Why on earth would it do that? That C-peptide reading at that level of insulin should have been 0. But it wasn't. The baby continued to make its own insulin, and we're not factoring that in here. In Professor Hindmarsh's calculations, with no mention of the insulin that the baby was making, as proved by what he says is irrefutable evidence of the insulin C-peptide. I can't emphasize enough, in the practice of medicine, I would never have relied on any of this stuff. And I would have insisted that all of this was checked again, because we have a lot of assumptions. And for me, that just is not good enough to convict someone on the basis of a story, someone who no one witnessed doing anything and happens to have spiked 2 bags of insulin with why his calculation is 4 bottles of the stuff, excluding what the baby would continue to make itself. And it had no effect on the baby really we're talking about. None of this, to this simple soul, makes any sense. I'll just conclude all this by saying, you heard hopefully if you listened to the file on 4, you heard Helen Shannon, a chemical engineer and a chemical engineer from New Zealand who's worked on neonatal insulin modelling for 25 years, say that these estimates are all wrong. And I'm pretty sure that this is all going to come to a head, because we can't rely on assumptions and calculations when there's many variables that are not included in this. And we just can't rely on it, in my opinion. I think that the case of BBF is a very, very weak case forensically, medically, scientifically. I think it's extremely weak, and it was very, very poorly defended. In the next episode, we will move on to the case of poor BBG. I'll see you then. Bye.